This is the Church as Collective lecture from our Wednesday class. It's going to serve in substitution for what we would have done during the snow day. So make sure that you're engaged in the material. This is actually a free note page in your interactive notebook, so you will get to design the notes as you see fit. Think about the way that we've been going through notes in the earlier part of the semester. I think you have the hang of it now. So be creative, be engaged, be an active learner that takes ownership of your education. That's the goal here. And you want to write notes and create notes that are going to help you make connections between what you've read thus far and where we're going in the class. And just to give you a sense of the direction we're headed, the larger notion of this lecture might center around what I'll call the Pauline mission. That is the job or the task of the Apostle Paul, who is perhaps the most important figure in the New Testament next to Jesus. And you could really make arguments for which of the two figures is the most important in the New Testament when it comes to thinking about it as artifact, text, and world. Hopefully by the end of this lecture, you'll begin to see why. So on tap for today are the following learning objectives. We're going to clarify our understanding of formative Christianity as a cosmopolitan development. You know what cosmopolitan is, and you know that Christianity is taking shape. What we mean by formative Christianity is the social movements that represent the beginnings of Christianity, even before Christianity is a term that people are bandying around. It's hard to remember that the name Christian comes after the actions of these social agents. So they didn't call themselves Christians from the beginning, right? Nowhere in the Gospels do you see the disciples calling themselves Christians. The label of Christian comes later in the timeline, and we are looking at, well, what are the steps that lead up to the beginning of that movement and its earliest steps as a movement, as a thing that we can identify as something that is recognizable to what we presume is Christianity today. So what is sort of the earliest form of Christianity look like? That's what we mean by formative Christianity. And it is a cosmopolitan development. And our second objective is to introduce Paul the evangelist. You remember in Koine Greek or Hellenistic Greek that the evangelion is the gospel. An evangelist is someone who writes a gospel or spreads a gospel message. Paul doesn't actually write one of the gospels that we have in our Bible, but Paul spreads a message about Jesus, about the basileia as it pertains to Jesus. And that is his good news that he'll be spreading to the poloi, the cities of the Mediterranean world. So we've been talking about the New Testament as a text, as an artifact, as a social world. We're going to connect the dots a little bit, but we're also going to sort of reframe some of the assumptions that you may have from what we've studied thus far. I'm just going to tailor or tune those so that you are even more critically astute about the history as it unfolds. For instance, you know how the good news of Jesus was the start of Christianity, right? Jesus doing his thing in Judea and Galilee, that's where the Christian story generally begins when we tell it. But actually, the Gospels that we read in class were among the last documents written in the New Testament. That is to say that even though we start off reading the Gospels, they're actually written after many of the texts in the New Testament. And while Jesus is the main character of the New Testament is by and about the early Christ followers. So most of the New Testament isn't actually about Jesus himself, but it's about people talking about Jesus, trying to follow Jesus, trying to understand Jesus, trying to make sense of Jesus so that they know how they fit into the basileia, both the Roman Empire itself, but also the promise of the Jewish kingdom from the covenant of the Israelites onto early Roman Jews, and also the sort of larger sense of the universe, right? The nature of the cosmos. And churches just divide and divide and divide in our contemporary world, right? You can go down the street and find multiple churches. If you drive down Market Street, you're going to pass the UCC church. You're going to pass a Christian church. You're going to pass Other churches, if you go further by Kmart and others, if you go into the neighborhood, you're going to find a Church of the Brethren. If you go further in the county, you're going to find lots of churches of the Brethren. You're going to find lots of Mennonite churches. There's all sorts of denominations or divisions within the Christian church. And some people think, well, that's a later phenomena. But actually, Christianity has always been tattered and is actually being woven. That is to say that Christianity has always had splits and divisions. It's never been a single unified thing, even in the time of the disciples, right? The disciples had all sorts of different perspectives and relationships to Jesus, right? Jesus has an inner circle, the ones that see the transfiguration, and there are the other disciples too, who are close to Jesus, but also not as close as Peter, for instance. We talk about the women that followed Jesus, especially in the Gospel of Luke, but they don't get named in the sort of list of the 12 disciples as we traditionally remember them. I say all this just to remind you that there are different levels of identification and relationships with this Jesus figure, and that's emblematic of Christianity as being a tattered social formation. It's always been in pieces, and if anything, we are seeing how these pieces are picked up into more coherent wholes. After all, when we say we're reading the New Testament in this class, I can assign you one giant Bible that represents the New Testament, despite the fact that there are all sorts of codices that make up what we understand as the contemporary text, right? Some editor has taken those, translated them, patched them together into a single text, but that's really an illusion, right? That's something someone has done to make it seem like a more cohesive whole. The reality of the Christian story is that it's one of many, many pieces. And we're going to look at that so we can take into account what all those different pieces are saying and what it says about this thing that comes from text, artifact, and social world that we call the New Testament. In the first half of our semester, we really covered about 300 BCE onto where it says Jesus' life in the first part of the first century of the Common Era. So you might say we went from 330, BCE to about 33 CE. That's about as much as we've covered. Now we're going to get into what happens shortly after Jesus dies and where does that message go. And this is going to be basically that list of Paul's ministry. I say James's death. James is the brother of Jesus. He's mentioned in some of the Gospels and elsewhere. We're going to look at sort of the first followers of Jesus. What happens to them? What do they do? How does Christianity come out of this stuff? And then we'll go all the way into the first Jewish war, which will lead us through the rest of the New Testament. And you know when the first Jewish war happens, about 70 CE. So that's where we're going to kind of stop our class. And that's the second half of this unit. So that's what we're in for on this timeline. Don't forget the stuff we've discussed before because it's really important to where we're going now. But we're going to set our sights on sort of the green portion of this timeline from here on out. If you're looking for a map to make sense of and keeping track of the geography of this part of the New Testament, you're going to want to look in your Bible at map 12. It's the map of the Roman world. This by far is going to be your best map when thinking about Paul and his journeys. You also have the map that you'll be memorizing in the timeline. That's already on Canvas, of course. It's going to be a map of the Mediterranean world. I think there are also some dates for you to memorize as well, and that will help you make more sense of the social world of the New Testament at this portion of the class. So enter the ecclesia. Ecclesia means, it's usually translated from the Greek as church. Ecclesia means church. I'm going to translate it slightly differently, but when we talk about ecclesia, you know what we're thinking of. The Jesus movement, right? Jesus and the followers of Jesus. We're thinking about cosmopolitan places. People are trying to figure out their place in the world, how to be citizens in the world. And the people who are doing this are Jews and Gentiles alike. The earliest Jesus movement can be summarized like this. You know, you've read the Gospels, the Synoptic Gospels by this point, but remember those come after. If we can talk about what the Gospel looks like in 33 CE, right after Jesus dies, it's basically this. Jesus was a Jewish teacher of renewal. He was a Lord of righteousness. That is, he was a model of how to do right and be right in covenant with God. He died in Jerusalem and was said to return as a sign of things to come. People kept saying he was coming back. He didn't just die, he was resurrected. And of course, you're thinking here of the Pharisees, right? The Pharisees as interpreters of the law who think about it not just in literal terms, but in more metaphorical and spiritual terms. And by spiritual, I mean like the letter versus the spirit of the law. The Sadducees are spiritual people too, but they were strict interpreters. The Pharisees are loose interpreters. And Jesus seems to be much more akin to the Pharisees, hence why he argues with them so much in the text. But he died, it was said to return, and is pointing to signs of things to come. So we might also think here, too, of John the Baptist and sign prophets, right? Pointing to how we should understand the unfolding of time. Jesus' disciples were sent out to evangelize and did so via baptism and banquets. That is, they went out calling people into baptism to be cleansed in water so that they could have new life in the covenant, understanding what true peace looks like. And they had meals, right? Do this in remembrance of me. They repeated this meal that Jesus had with his disciples, the Last Supper. This was a ritual that was done by other Christians from the earliest days, right? Christians ate together, in other words. A few things about terminology here. A disciple just means a student, right? If you go to the gymnasium and are undergoing paideia, you are a disciple of a teacher. You are a student. Apostle, which a lot of English users use interchangeably with disciple, actually has a slightly different nuance. An apostle is one who is sent out, like post, like your postal, your post office, your postal workers, right? It means they send letters. A apostle is one who is sent out. Jesus sent out the disciples to spread his message, to evangelize. So those who are sent out by Jesus to go and make disciples of all the nations are called apostles. So the 12 apostles are the ones that Jesus entrusted with going out and spreading his message. So his disciples were sent out to evangelize as apostles. And the ways they did this included not just preaching the message, but also inviting people into baptism and to banquets, meals. Where this happened is of great concern to us because it helps give us a sense of what sort of artifacts we can imagine and the Sitzum Leben of the stuff we're reading in the New Testament. Christianity didn't take shape in churches as we understand them today. There were no set-off buildings that were designated as churches and solely churches. There was no first church of Jerusalem that people went to do Christianity. In fact, that Greek word for church, ekklesia, means something more akin to collective. And you can even kind of see the word kaleo in Greek means to call out. So I call ecclesias collectives. I think these are the communities that understand themselves to be called out by the message that is the gospel, called out by the promise of the good news, called out by Jesus himself and the apostles who were that he entrusted with that message, to come together, to feast with one another, to fellowship with one another, to better understand their place in the world as a community in covenant with God. And this happened largely in cities, because cities are where most of the people are, and they're the easiest places to get to. So think about the rise of Christianity in these terms. It happens in Greek. The standard language for Christianity to spread is Hellenistic or Koine Greek. It is spread, the apostles were able to go out because of the roads, sea lines, and bureaucracy that existed in the Roman Empire, right? So already we're thinking about Hellenism and with Koine Greek, but also Romanization, that there are roads, that there are safe seaways from pirates and the like. There's bureaucracy, there are offices, right? Organization to make social formations happen. Like you can have representation in government. You have a post office in the Roman world, right? Romans had mail. Okay, we sleep on that. Oh, mail, whatever. That's a huge deal because the New Testament correspondence between these various people happens vis-a-vis mail. When you can't get there physically, what do? You write a letter. That's a huge invention, right? So bureaucracy, particularly in terms of a post office, is really important. Also, you have a military that helps protect this world, and that keeps things safe, so people are able to travel fairly freely. Standard political and cultural attitudes. There's an assumption about identity. There's a shared, not only language, but shared sense of metaphor. We're going to see this in a lot of the group presentations. Family metaphors, sports metaphors, household metaphors. These are all going to be important in the language used to spread the gospel. And this is all embodied in the polis, the standard social and cultural pattern for organizing oneself or fitting into the Roman world. So what does it look like? What type of stuff goes on in a polis in the Roman world? Well, and you see a picture there on your map. That's a street with households and probably shops in a town called Pergamum, which is in sort of modern day Turkey. I was going to see if I could find it on the map that you have in your Bible, but I don't see. Oh yeah, Pergamum is going to be at D3 on the Roman world map, and it's in Asia Minor, modern day Turkey. So on that street, on the bottom, you would probably see what are called shops. Like think about Market Street here. On the bottom, you have shops, and on the top, a lot of times people live in those shops. You might also have people living in courtyards, okay, where they have what are called insulae. So you have kind of like suite living in the dorms, where you have maybe a common room and then apartments connected to that common room. That's sort of how housing worked in the ancient Roman world. And families shared a courtyard, where people with close sort of clannish connections shared a courtyard. But they were all, like these houses were all sort of connected around there, and these insulae, right? You were insulated. But oftentimes if you had a shop, you would live above your shop. So family becomes really important. Guilds are important. Guilds represent the sort of people who have similar jobs. So blacksmiths in a city might all be in connection with one another as a guild. Guilds are people in a shared profession. And these people in a shared profession often did things for the good of the city as a whole. They might work together in what's called philanthropy, giving gifts back for the love of the people. Philanthropy literally means love of the people. A philosophy is love of knowledge. Philo meaning love, sophos meaning knowledge. Philanthropy means love of anthropos, people. And so guilds would give back to the community with their gifts and services to make the city better for the good of the Roman Empire, for the good of the people who lived in it. So guilds are a type of ecclesia. Families are a type of ecclesia, right? Sharing resources in an insula. The gymnasium is a type of ecclesia, right? Students coming together around a teacher, being disciples, learning those lessons. And lastly, cults. That is, communities that get together and practice rituals for the good of understanding themselves and bringing together the community in a way that binds them, keeps them good with the rhythms of the universe. So think about groups that are doing things like prayer, worshiping a particular god in a certain way, or they may have like a god that they focus on, they worship the others, but they're really into Dionysus, the god of wine. They're really into the god of the harvest. They're really into the god of the sea, whatever. Like they may like take that god as their patron god and lift up that god, sing songs, do rituals, eat foods in honor of that god, and also for the good of the larger community. What we forget about religion in the ancient world, right, is not like as we practice today, right? I told you religion binds people together and binds the world together. It keeps the world in solid relationship. So you often in a cult, right, think of like culture, do things in a group that are good for the universe. It keeps the world spinning. If you keep the gods happy, it keeps the world spinning. It keeps the seasons happening. So people gather together to worship different gods based upon their inclinations. And you could say this whole baptism practice is a cult practice, right? That you will die to your old self and become washed anew into a new self. That's a cult. Get away from the modern understanding of cult being a bad thing. Think about a culture that cultivates practices that keep the world religare, right? Bound together. Keep the world seculare, in order. So guilds, families, gymnasia, cults, these are all examples of all examples of ecclesia. And the church could be understood in this time as similar to all of these, right? People coming together for common practices for a common good. Our best understanding of ecclesia in the ancient world come from this guy named Paul. Paul lived from probably 35 to 62. He didn't live 35 to 62. His ministry happened between 35 and 62. He was roughly contemporary with Jesus in his lifetime, but he did his ministry in Christianity from 35 to 62. And he would say something like he was a follower of the way, right? Because Christianity wasn't a term people were using. He was a Pharisee that likely converted to Christianity. Or took up this Jesus way as something really important. In fact, we know he persecuted Christians by his own admission. He used to be a Pharisee who would go out and basically beat up Christians. He would take them toe to toe, possibly physically, but certainly in preaching, right? His job, his hustle for money was that he was a tent maker. He was a builder of sorts, right? Because if you go back to the ecclesia, right, someone had to keep up this stuff. Someone had to build these things, and you can't see them here, but they're likely like awnings, tent cloths and stuff. This is the type of thing that he did. He was a carpenter, tent maker of sorts, and so he was always finding business in all these different cities. This map that you see here on the slide are all the different places he went for business purposes, but also to later spread the good news. And he would do this in synagogues, right? Another kind of collective, this collective of Jewish people. They would go in these courtyards and study the law and deal with practices amongst them, and amongst the people who identify with the covenant. Well, Paul used to preach there, just like he did back in the old days. He would preach the good news, and people would take it or leave it. One thing that made Paul probably set apart from a lot of his Jewish contemporaries was that he was friendly to Gentiles and to God-fearers. And he said that the Jesus message was actually for both of those groups. You'll find that actually many of the followers of Jesus went strictly to Jews, or at least were more focused on Jews getting the Jesus message. Paul was like, nah, the Gentiles, the kingdom is for them too. And so he was friendly to Gentiles and he was friendly to God-fearers, and he rivaled this Jerusalem set, right? All those followers who were there with Jesus in Jerusalem. He was like, y'all are good and y'all do your thing reaching to the Jews, but this message is for people beyond. Hence, he goes throughout the Mediterranean spreading the good news. And we know this because we have his epistles. Think about apostle, epistle, postal. Epistle means letter. We have his letters in the New Testament. They're the earliest texts that we have. And we also have writings about Paul in the book of Acts, which is like the sequel to the Gospel of Luke, written by the same guy. Paul is discussed for a good half of that book. So from Paul's own hand, his epistles, from writings associated with Paul, like in Acts and others, we can sort of get a sense of where he went, what it was about, what his mission was, what his theology was, and how it developed over time. And what is clear as we put Paul in the context of artifact, text, and world is that his mission was made possible by Hellenism and Romanization. In fact, early Christianity emerges at the crossroads of Hellenism, Romanization, and Second Temple Judaism. So as we think through the formation of Christianity, we need to keep in mind, where are we getting this stuff? We have pottery, we have inscriptions, we have remains. We even know these places, like some of these places still exist. In fact, many of them still exist today. So we have ruins from the ancient world. These are artifacts, right? We understand the history of this time period because it's well attested in not just the writings of Josephus, but historians of all kinds in the Roman world. And from that, we're able to make better sense of the world that Paul navigated. So we understand his concerns in addition to the dates and places where he was at places. We also have the texts themselves as listed in the New Testament, and they contain arguments, desires, drama being worked out in this first century period. And it's in that crucible that Christianity happens. And to appreciate it the most, you've got to understand the developments of Hellenism, Romanization, and Second Temple Judaism. So as you read your textbook and as we get into the book of Acts for next week, think about these features as they come about, and think about them not just in what you studied in this class, but what you studied in light of the larger history of Western civilization, because that all comes together to create the past out of which we understand the New Testament. So I look forward to seeing how we put this together in the coming days. Study hard, make connections, reread your notes, reread the textbook, put this stuff together in light of the lecture you've seen here, and we'll be off to a good start when we study Acts next week.